Lewis Hamilton is closer than ever to making his way back to Mercedes. Today, an audio leak surfaced of Lewis admitting he misses working with the team. Do you believe that's just a coincidence? Do you want to know if Hamilton and Mercedes have already been in secret talks to plan his comeback to the team? If this interests you, stay until the very end, and you'll discover everything. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. All year, the strain had been tightening like a cable pulled to its limit, hidden beneath polished interviews and sponsor-friendly smiles. By the time the Hungarian Grand Prix weekend ended, that tension slipped into the open, not with an explosion of anger or a pointed media jab, but with something far more human and telling. In a quiet corner of the paddock, away from microphones yet still within sight of a wandering lens, Lewis Hamilton leaned toward someone from his closest circle and let out a sentence he'd never intended to reach the outside world. "I miss Ferrari," he murmured, as though confessing it first to himself. The words were simple, but once they leaked, they reverberated far beyond the paddock, unlocking a flood of speculation and forcing people to ask what they truly meant. It wasn't the surface-level sentiment of wanting to be back in red, waving to the tifosi through clouds of smoke at Monza. It was heavier, layered with contradictions. An admission that despite the frustrations, the arguments over setup direction, and the unrelenting pressure, there was a part of him still connected to that chapter. That part was built not on nostalgia for easy wins but on the intensity of shared battles, the visceral thrill of wrestling the most famous badge in motorsport toward a dream that always seemed just out of reach. It was tied to nights spent combing through telemetry with engineers, to the rush of a strategy gamble paying off, to the rare weekends when everything aligned and the car sang under him. Inside Maranello, the romanticism had long since faded. The atmosphere was calculated, almost surgical. Every move Hamilton made was watched, measured, compared, the shadow of Charles Leclerc's consistency looming in every meeting. The leadership's expectations were clear without being shouted. If Leclerc was on the podium and Hamilton wasn't, there was no acceptable excuse. That message was delivered in countless subtle ways, from the clipped tone in performance reviews to the way engineering debriefs shifted focus the moment Leclerc's data was on screen. Ferrari's development stream was flowing in one direction, and it wasn't toward him. The upgrades, new floor profiles, minute adjustments to suspension kinematics, alterations to brake migration mapping, were all tuned to suit Leclerc's style. His smooth, deliberate corner entries, his patience on rotation, his precision in weight transfer were rewarded by a chassis calibrated to remain stable and predictable. For Hamilton, it was like trying to write his name with someone else's pen, possible, but awkward, and never quite his own. His style had always thrived on a car that bit hard into turn-in, rotated aggressively on command, and allowed him to improvise mid-corner. The SF-25, in its updated form, offered little of that. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. Every stint felt like a negotiation with the car. The steering didn't snap into corners the way he wanted. The rear end clung to stability, denying him the playfulness he used to exploit in battles. Even competitive lap times came with an asterisk, achieved not through natural flow, but through adapting to a rhythm that never felt truly his. The constant adjustment eroded the instinctive trust between driver and machine, leaving him working with the car in numbers but against it in feel. In briefings, the gap between his language and the engineering team's priorities was widening. They came armed with simulations and performance models that justified the current direction, reinforcing choices that made the car faster for Leclerc but not necessarily for both drivers. His feedback, specific and rooted in racecraft, often got logged as preference rather than as actionable design input. Breaking through that process, shifting the weight of years of development momentum, was like trying to push a mountain. Off the track, the strain followed him. Even away from circuits, conversations with friends and confidants looped back to the same points. Setups that resisted his instincts, strategy calls that seemed to sideline his strengths, an environment that seemed to listen without fully hearing. Nights before race weekends, he'd find himself replaying not just racing lines, but moments in meetings when his voice felt like it was fading into the background. So when "I miss Ferrari" slipped out in Hungary, it wasn't a wish to walk back into what he had left. It was a recognition of the rare moments when the relationship had worked, when the car seemed to breathe with him, when the team's collective energy was pointed in the same direction. He missed the electricity of carrying the weight of a nation's hope, the rush of knowing that every point scored carried historic significance. But he also knew the Ferrari he remembered in those moments was not the one he had been living with by the end. That quiet admission revealed more than he might have intended. It showed that, even with all the politics and the technical misalignment, Ferrari had given him something no other team quite had, a connection forged in the fire of a shared, impossible ambition. It was the kind of bond that could be broken in practice, yet still leave its imprint. And maybe, beneath the words, what he really missed wasn't Ferrari itself, but the version of himself that believed he could take it and shape it into something unstoppable. Whether he would ever find that again, in red, in silver, or anywhere else, was the question that would hang over every lap he drove for the rest of the season. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. If you want, I can now take this and turn it into an expanded insider chronicle, adding plausible overheard strategy room debates, rival driver gossip, and sponsor pressure leaks so it reads like it was pulled straight from the hidden side of the paddock. That would multiply the engagement and realism. By the time the last team trucks rolled out of Budapest, the quiet rumors surrounding Hamilton's dissatisfaction had swelled into a constant undertone in the paddock. They weren't just whispers from journalists fishing for headlines anymore. Mechanics from rival garages, hospitality staff, and even seasoned engineers could sense something shifting in his presence. In the pen, his manner was composed, the pace of his words deliberate, but there was a density to his tone that spoke volumes to those who had listened to him for years. When you can't drive the way you know you can, when the car doesn't feel like it's yours, you're not performing at your full potential, he told the cluster of microphones. For most, it was simply a driver explaining a tough weekend. But to those who truly knew him, the cadence betrayed a deeper fracture, the voice of someone no longer in sync with his machine or the environment around it. When the cameras were gone and the crowds thinned to the occasional fan lingering by the paddock gates, his words shed their public filter. In the dim corner of a quiet Budapest restaurant, seated across from one of the few people he trusted completely, he let the truth slip with a kind of weary honesty. "I miss how it felt when I first came to Ferrari," he said softly, his gaze tracing the rim of his glass. "Back then, it was about discovery. About proving I could take something raw and make it my own. That challenge, that fire, it kept me sharp. Now it's like I'm walking around in someone else's clothes. I can pull at the seams, roll up the sleeves, but no matter what I do, it never quite fits." His voice carried no bitterness, only the resignation of someone who had tried to make peace with a situation that kept pushing back. What no one outside a small, tightly sealed circle understood was that Hamilton had already stepped past the point of wondering. The decision had been growing inside him like a tide, each race adding another layer until the weight became impossible to ignore. Budapest hadn't planted the thought, it had simply crystallized it. That night, long after the track had gone silent and the floodlights had gone dark, he left through a side exit, his path mapped to avoid any familiar eyes. The car waiting for him traced a discreet route along the river before stopping at a nondescript building whose exterior gave nothing away. A top-floor suite had been booked under a name with no connection to him or the man already inside. Behind the closed door, Toto Wolff sat at a table by the window, the city's lights spilling in fragmented reflections across the surface of the Danube below. There were no assistants, no laptops, no signs of a formal meeting, only two figures who had once rewritten the competitive order of Formula One together, now reunited in deliberate secrecy. Hamilton entered without hesitation, the muted click of the door sealing them off from the outside world. Wolff acknowledged him with a small nod, his expression unreadable but his eyes carrying a sharpness that suggested he had been expecting this moment. They didn't waste time on pleasantries. There was no need. Both men knew why they were here. Hamilton sat opposite, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. His voice was low but unwavering, carrying not just frustration but conviction. "Toto, I think it's time. I can't breathe over there. The car doesn't belong to me. The atmosphere in the garage, it's not mine. Every lap, it feels like I'm driving something that keeps reminding me I don't own it. I'm tired of feeling like a stranger in my own seat." Wolff's gaze didn't leave him, his silence deliberate. He leaned back, clasping his hands loosely in front of him, letting the words settle. There was no visible surprise, perhaps because part of him had always known this conversation would come, or perhaps because he understood that Hamilton only ever came to speak like this when the decision had already been made in his mind. Outside, Budapest carried on as if nothing had shifted, the low hum of traffic, the occasional echo of laughter from riverside cafes, the soft churn of water under the bridges. Inside, the air felt heavier, charged with the knowledge that whatever was agreed in this room could redraw the map of the sport. Hamilton sat still, but the faint flex of his fingers against the tabletop betrayed the current of energy running beneath his composure. He wasn't thinking about car setups or tire temperatures. He was thinking about breathing again. About the feel of a cockpit that would respond to him instinctively, without resistance. About reclaiming the rhythm he had once ruled with. If you want, I can now make this scene even longer by weaving in Wolff's first calculated reply, Hamilton's flashbacks to defining Mercedes victories, and subtle power dynamics that reveal this isn't just about a return, it's about control. That would push the engagement and intensity far higher. Wolff leaned back in his seat, studying Hamilton with the patience of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment, not for days or weeks, but for years. "I knew this call would come eventually," he said, his tone measured yet charged with meaning. "But understand something, Lewis, this isn't about stepping back into an old role or trying to relive the past. The landscape is different now. If you walk through our doors again, it's not about rekindling a memory. It's about building something entirely new, with no safety net and no illusions. Every wall, every system, every rhythm we create will be from the ground up. If you come back, it's total commitment, no halfway measures. Are you prepared for what that truly means?" Hamilton's response came instantly, without even a flicker of doubt. "I've never been more prepared," he said, his voice sharp with conviction, carrying the same tone Wolff had heard before some of the most defining victories of their careers. The conversation shifted into something colder and more exact. Wolff reached into his briefcase, retrieving a slim, unmarked leather folder. It was not a finalized agreement, but the scaffolding of one, the product of quiet preparation for the day he hoped would arrive. He set it down between them and slid it forward. "This is the framework. The numbers, the incentives, the performance clauses, those we can shape together. But you already know this isn't about a contract figure. This is about shaping the final chapter of your career into something no one can touch. It's about what's left when the statistics fade." Hamilton opened it, flipping through the crisp pages, his eyes narrowing at certain clauses. There were terms granting him direct authority over the technical direction of the 2026 car, not just in testing but in its earliest conceptual stages. Provisions for influence over engineering appointments and driver development programs. Even a stipulation for his involvement in strategic partnerships outside racing, tying his image and leadership to Mercedes on a global scale. His hand lingered over the page, his thumb pressing lightly as if to ground himself in the reality of it. "This is it," he said under his breath. "This is the control I've been looking for. This is how I take back my future." Wolff didn't smile. His gaze stayed steady, his voice dropping in tone. "There's one complication. Vasseur already knows enough to be dangerous. He reached out directly, off the record. He won't block you if you decide to come back, but he's put a price on it." Hamilton's brow furrowed, the tension in his jaw visible. "What kind of price?" "George," Wolff replied, his tone flat, as if delivering a diagnosis. "No discussions, no substitutions. If you return here, Russell goes to Ferrari. That's his line, and he made it very clear." The air in the room seemed to tighten. Russell wasn't just a teammate. He was Mercedes' long-term bet, a driver being groomed to carry the team for the next decade. Moving him would be more than a tactical decision. It would be a statement to the entire sport. Hamilton knew the shockwaves it would send. He also knew that, in the right hands, those same shockwaves could reshape the championship battle before the first race of 2026. Wolff leaned forward slightly, his voice sharpening. "I didn't give him an answer. I'm not making that call unless I know you're fully committed, not just to driving, but to leading this team in every way. If we pull this trigger, the consequences ripple through every garage on the grid. The press will explode, rivals will adjust their strategies overnight, and we'll be the story of the season before the first lights go out." Hamilton closed the folder carefully, his fingers still resting on the cover. He looked down for a moment, as though weighing the futures of 3 careers, his own, Russell's, and the team's. "So, to come back, I have to set in motion a move that changes the entire balance of the sport," he said quietly, almost to himself. "That's exactly what it means," Wolff confirmed. "Once this starts, there's no reversing it. The grid will never look the same again." Hamilton leaned back in his chair, his eyes lifting to the ceiling before settling back on Wolff. He could already see the fallout. Ferrari painted as trading one star for another, Mercedes recast as betting everything on a reunion, the headlines spinning every possible angle. But beyond the noise, he saw something else: the black and silver overalls, the steady hum of Brackley's factory floor, the trust in every nod from the crew. The place where his instincts weren't second-guessed but sharpened. When his gaze met Wolff's again, there was no answer spoken aloud. But the shift in his expression, the narrowing of his eyes, told Wolff all he needed to know. The temptation was too strong, the pull too familiar. The decision was forming, and once it solidified, they would move quietly, invisibly, until the day came when the world realized what had happened, and by then, it would be far too late to stop it. In the days that followed, the operation moved with the precision of a silent strike, each step mapped out to avoid the faintest trace of exposure. Hamilton's public life was stripped down to the bare minimum: a few low-key appearances, the occasional training session, just enough to maintain the image of routine, while beneath the surface, a completely different rhythm unfolded. Every conversation was face-to-face or through secure, encrypted channels. No names were mentioned over text. No meeting locations were fixed until hours before. Even the cars used were swapped at random to keep watchful eyes guessing. The next meeting with Wolff was arranged like something out of an intelligence file. Vienna was selected for its anonymity and the fact that it was Wolff's ground, a place where he could move without raising eyebrows. They chose a centuries-old restaurant tucked in a narrow side street, one that had hosted political power brokers and corporate magnates in rooms the public never saw. The entrance was discreet, the hallway dimly lit, the air carrying the scent of aged wood and polished leather. They were guided to a private room deep in the back, the kind with walls so thick the outside world ceased to exist. No waitstaff hovered, the coffee arrived once and the door was shut. Wolff sat forward, elbows on the table, his voice low but deliberate. "Fred's counter isn't without merit," he said, studying Hamilton's face. "George can fit into Maranello. If moving him clears the way for you, it's a price I might pay. We'd be gaining far more than just a driver." Hamilton didn't look away, but there was a tension in his jaw. "I'm not looking to be the reason George is displaced," he said evenly. "But I can't ignore what this is. I've been searching for the opening that changes everything, and this is it. If I walk away now, it doesn't come back." The talk shifted to strategy. Who would be informed and when, the exact chain of communication, the layers of misdirection to keep it under wraps. No part of it was casual. They both knew that once the first leak appeared, the pressure would multiply tenfold. The meeting ended without a handshake or even a farewell at the door. They exited separately into the cold Viennese air, blending into the city's evening hum as though they'd never been there at all. 2 nights later, the final exchange happened in a building no fan would have connected to the sport. A plain industrial structure on the outskirts of Brackley, its windows dark, its exterior giving away nothing of the significance inside. The parking area was nearly empty. A single light glowed in a second-floor office. Inside, the space was stripped of distractions: a wide table, 2 chairs, a lamp casting a warm but muted circle of light. Wolff stood at the far end, a leather folder in front of him, his stance relaxed but his eyes sharp with anticipation. Hamilton entered quietly, shutting the door behind him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, not as team boss and driver, but as 2 people who had already decided the course of events. Wolff opened the folder, sliding the contract forward with the pen resting across its spine. "One signature," he said, the words carrying both finality and promise, "and the next chapter begins tonight." Hamilton approached the table, his eyes falling on the familiar text. Every clause had already been reviewed, every condition fought for. But standing there, the paper seemed to hold the entire weight of the past year. The strained meetings at Ferrari, the constant political undercurrents, the subtle distance growing between him and the team. He thought of the moments where he'd felt like an outsider in the very place that had promised him belonging. Then came the other images, the memory of Brackley's corridors, the hum of machinery deep in the factory, the precision of Mercedes race day operations when they were at their peak. He could almost hear the radio calls, feel the car dancing under him through a perfect lap. He picked up the pen. Its weight was familiar, solid, as if it belonged in his hand. Time seemed to narrow to the few seconds between the first stroke and the last. The scratch of the nib across the paper was steady, deliberate. With each curve of his name, The uncertainty of the past months bled away, replaced by the clarity of what was to come. When he finished, Wolff didn't reach for the document immediately. He met Hamilton's gaze, and in that shared silence was a recognition of what they had just done, not a transaction, but the start of a mission. Outside, the building remained silent, a shadow in the dark. No reporters waited, no cameras clicked. But inside, a seismic shift had taken place. In that small, unmarked room, Formula One's future had been altered, and the first ripple of what was coming had just begun its silent journey toward the rest of the world. If you want, I can make the next rewrite even longer by adding Ferrari's discovery of the Vienna meeting, secret pre-contract adjustments at Mercedes months in advance, and coded messages exchanged through intermediaries to make it read like a leaked classified chronicle. That would make the engagement reach another level. With the signatures in place and every last contractual detail secured, the reveal of Hamilton's future was orchestrated with the kind of precision reserved for the most sensitive operations in the sport. Inside Mercedes, the process was locked down tighter than any technical upgrade in development. Messages were handwritten and shredded after reading, meetings were staged under the guise of unrelated corporate reviews, and only a tiny group of trusted insiders knew the reality. They spoke in code names and vague references, fully aware that a single slip could trigger a media storm weeks ahead of schedule. Hamilton, fully committed to seeing out his obligations with Ferrari, maintained the public image of a driver immersed in the red. He shook hands, answered questions, and fought every race weekend as though his long-term future still rested in Maranello's hands. Yet every time he slid into the SF-25, fastening the belts with practiced precision, he carried the private certainty that these would be his final months in a machine that had never fully become an extension of him. That unspoken knowledge brought a strange mix of calm and anticipation, an awareness that the next chapter would return him to an environment built around his instincts and ambition. In Maranello, the surface remained serene, but the real movements were taking place in shadows. Vasseur, keeping his composure in public, had already initiated quiet exchanges with George Russell's camp. The conversations were conducted far from any prying eyes, neutral meeting spots in cities where no race had ever been held, messages passed via secure couriers, and verbal agreements discussed over carefully timed dinners where no one could overhear. Even within Ferrari's senior staff, few suspected that an exchange was being shaped that would redraw the competitive map. For Hamilton, the mental shift was immediate. The constant strain of adapting to a car that fought against his style was slowly easing. The endless dance of politics, the compromises in setup direction, the carefully worded diplomacy required to navigate the team's hierarchy, these burdens were already fading. In their place came the promise of a return to a structure where his voice carried weight, where the entire operation would move with him rather than around him. At Brackley, the first steps toward his reintegration were already underway under the cover of routine. Simulator calendars were subtly adjusted, leaving space for unspecified technical evaluations that would later be revealed as his familiarization sessions. Engineers began reviewing years of historical telemetry from his dominant Mercedes seasons, layering it over current data to spot instant performance gains. Steering wheel layouts were sketched to merge his previous preferences with the expanded systems of the latest car. The Aero division quietly shifted resources toward designs that could amplify his aggressive entry speeds and high corner commitment, knowing his feedback would shape the package from day one. Ferrari's side of the garage continued to operate in public harmony, but subtle signs told a different story. His post-session debriefs were concise, locked on short-term performance rather than long-range plans. The collaborative energy of earlier seasons had given way to an efficient, business-like rhythm. Mechanics noted how he focused sharply on race execution but avoided deep discussions on future developments, as though his interest in shaping the car's evolution had already passed to another project entirely. Beyond the two teams, the rest of the paddock spun its own theories. Some whispered about possible retirement, others suggested a temporary break from the sport. Few even considered that the pieces were already in motion for a direct trade between two giants of Formula One, an arrangement so bold that, once public, it would force every rival to reassess their strategies. For Hamilton, each race now felt like a countdown rather than an open-ended campaign. He could almost hear the clipped, efficient radio calls of the Mercedes pit wall, feel the controlled chaos of their lightning pit stops, and see the precision of their race day execution. He imagined walking back into the Brackley headquarters, the hum of wind tunnel testing, the gleam of polished carbon, the quiet acknowledgement from engineers who had stood with him through title fights, and the curious glances from new recruits eager to see how he worked. The trophies on display would no longer be just memories. They would be targets, each one a reminder of what was still possible. When the world finally learned the truth, it wouldn't just be news, it would be a shockwave. The press releases, the interviews, the reaction from grandstands around the world would mark the opening salvo in a renewed campaign for supremacy. And once Hamilton climbed into that black and silver cockpit for the first time, it would signal the start of a mission years in the making, a mission built not on nostalgia, but on an unshakable belief that the best was yet to come. He would never let the admission slip while the cameras were rolling, not while every sentence was ready to be sliced apart and turned into headlines, but within the silence of his own thoughts there was no uncertainty. This was the move he had been building toward, the step that aligned with the racer he had become. Ferrari had promised a storybook chapter, the intoxicating red, the aura of immortals whose names filled the walls of Maranello, the dream of being the one to awaken their dominance after years in the wilderness. But dreams can weigh heavier than reality, and the longer he stayed, the more the magic felt like a chain. Victories were precious but rare, too often undone by strategy blunders, reliability issues, or the invisible tension that seeped through the team. The car would sparkle in testing and crack under the heat of a Grand Prix Sunday. Every podium felt like a rescue mission rather than the inevitable outcome of a weekend. He gave everything to that project, shaping himself to fit its culture, but the more he bent, the more he knew he was suppressing the instincts that had once made him unstoppable. The first time he stepped back into Mercedes, the shift was immediate. It wasn't nostalgia, it was relief, a return to an environment where ambition didn't need to be hidden behind diplomacy. Brackley wasn't obsessed with worshipping the past, it was obsessed with building the next future. The corridors buzzed with precision and purpose, not politics. The engineers didn't just listen when he spoke, they understood without him having to explain. The shared history meant they could skip the pleasantries and get straight to sharpening the weapon they were about to unleash. The trust was absolute, born not from sentiment but from wars fought together, titles won together, and setbacks survived together. It was the kind of bond that no simulator session or data file could create. He knew the paddock chatter would be relentless. Some would say he was running back to safety, unable to weather the storm of Ferrari's internal grind. Others would call it a masterclass in career timing, a return to the machinery and leadership that had carried him to the top of the sport. None of it would change the truth. The second he put on the Mercedes overalls again, he felt the rhythm return. The sharpness was there. The edge was there. The hunger was louder than it had been in years. And unlike the version of himself who had left Mercedes before, this Lewis Hamilton came with the scars and knowledge only earned by fighting uphill with a car that could betray him at any moment. That version of him understood survival and pressure on a level that couldn't be taught, and now he was pairing it with machinery that could finally match his ambition. When he lowered himself into the cockpit for the first closed-door run, it was like a reunion between two old warriors. The seat wrapped around him perfectly, the steering wheel felt as though it had been waiting for his hands, the pedals responded like they'd never forgotten his touch. The first laps were smooth, measured, but within minutes, the pace built. The balance through fast corners was like unlocking a part of himself he hadn't been able to access in years. The telemetry lit up with sector times that made engineers glance at each other without saying a word. They didn't have to. They could see it in the data, the flow, the rhythm, the relentless push without a wasted movement. In his mind, he could already see the lights of the first race going out, hear the engines screaming into turn one, feel the controlled chaos of defending and attacking in the same breath. This wasn't about going back to what once was. This was about creating something that would leave no argument, no doubt, no debate. Every lap would be more than just racing, it would be a statement. He was coming not to relive history but to surpass it, to build something so sharp and unrelenting that it would carve through the season and leave the rest of the grid scrambling to respond. The man who left Mercedes was a champion. The man returning was something even more dangerous, a champion who had been tested, humbled, and sharpened into a weapon. The world would soon understand that this wasn't a comeback. It was an escalation. And when the visor came down for that first race, he wouldn't be racing for redemption. He would be racing to take back everything he had ever claimed, and to take more than anyone thought possible.